Hey everyone, welcome back to part 3 of episode 49. This episode we're looking at round birthday albums. We did 1972 and 1982 in the previous two parts, and now we're going to look at 1992 albums that are turning 30 this year. I'm going to confess that out of the three, 1982 was the one that I think I was most familiar with. 1992, for me anyway, my personal music journey, is the beginning of the 1990s. I was coming out of my Christian rock and Christian metal era, so I don't really know so much of what was happening in the scene at the time. I could probably name a couple of good Christian albums, like Tourniquet's third album, Pathogenic Ocular Dissonance, but I actually preferred their previous one, Psychosurgery, better. But anyway, the 1992 music scene was very interesting. Previously, 1991, and I think that's because last year a lot of these albums turned 30 last year, but in 1991 it was just such a big year because there was this whole transition with the grunge movement, so-called grunge movement, coming on, and of course Nirvana's Nevermind album and several other bands releasing albums at that time. I think there were a couple, or a few even, videos on YouTube of the time, Rick Beato and some others, talking about what a great year 1991 was for rock. But 1992 for a lot of bands was actually a very difficult year. Looking back to this book here, Metal on Ice, Tales from Canada's Hard Rock and Heavy Metal Heroes by Sean Kelly. I actually think, I don't know if he's still playing guitar for Helix, but a few years ago he was. It talks about bands like Slick Toxic and Svengali, Canadian hair metal bands who had released a debut album and whose careers seemed to be taking off, and then suddenly in 1992 they were told, well, you have to change your image and you have to change your sound. And I think it was Svengali who came out with an album that year or the year after, and it just really had a completely different sound to it. Very different from the hair metal sound. Slick Toxic, I don't remember if they managed a second album or not, or if they just split up. And even for thrash metal bands, it was a tough year because suddenly the grunge thing was in and thrash metal was also kind of on the way out. Canada's Sacrifice, I think they released one more album around that time, and then they said, look, if we play thrash and if that's not what you want to hear, then we're not going to play. And they actually stopped playing for many years. Other bands, a lot of thrash bands, managed to develop into the kind of groove metal sound. You can take a look at Sepultura from Brazil. They actually a very good band for morphing their sound depending on what's big at the time, and they managed to graduate from thrash metal and went into the groove metal thing. But also, it wasn't such a impossible time for metal because 1991 was also a really big year for death metal. A lot of death metal bands coming out with brilliant albums in 1991. So when we get to 1992, what's interesting is a lot of the bands who hadn't released albums yet managed to release an album in 1992. But a lot of my favorite ones, and a lot of the ones I also heard people talking about on YouTube and the internet in 1991, they didn't release an album that year. So, when I started looking at what were the big albums of the year in 1992, I knew a lot of the artists, but they weren't albums or artists I really had in my collection. Or some of them I probably should have. But let's take a look at the albums that were coming out that year. So, Nevermind, Nirvana's Nevermind, released in 1991. January 11th, it reached number 1 on the charts in the US. And then we just had a whole bunch of albums by those kinds of bands. Alice in Chains, Dirt, probably their biggest album. Stone Temple Pilots, Core, Blind Melon, self-titled album. Other bands like Soul Asylum, REM. And then this other kind, it's not, I don't know what you call it actually. I would call it this more kind of like East Coast pre-grunge type thing. But anyway, bands, for example, like Pavement and Sonic Youth. Also, Screaming Trees, who are actually from the West Coast, but also had an album. And then you have like the Black Crowes, Faith No More. Aphex Twin, I honestly don't know about them, but because I mentioned them when I talked about Nine Inch Nails, they helped do a lot of the remixes for the Further Down the Spiral album. So because the name popped up again, I included it here. Neil Young released an album called Harvest Moon in 1992, which is interesting because 1972, his album was Harvest. 20 years later, he's doing Harvest Moon. Okay. Let's see, Tori Amos. Yeah, I wasn't that album, but I remember Tori Amos around that time. I liked her. I still have one of her albums. Annie Lennox, Bon Jovi, Beastie Boys, and then we get into the new kid on the block, so to speak, for the 90s. We get the whole hip-hop and rap type thing here. We've got Arrested Development, Dr. Dre, Ice Cube, Body Count release an album with Ice-T in there. And then in Canada, we had Katie Lang releasing one of, I think, her biggest album ever, Bare Naked Ladies debut, Tragically Hip debut, Ace of Base from Sweden with I Saw the Sign. They were really big for a while. Ugly Kid Joe, L7, and some of the old boys, Elton John, Lou Reed, Peter Gabriel, Bruce Springsteen, Roger Waters, and Prince, all putting out albums in 1992. So, yeah, lots happening that year. A little bit closer to home now. Some of the bands that I have in my collection, including some of the albums I have, but I didn't pick for my top 7. We have Def Leppard with Adrenalize. No, I don't have it, but anyway, I have Def Leppard. Pantera, Vulgar Display of Power. That one and Cowboys from Hell are their, I think, 2 biggest albums, and very important albums for metal in the early 90s for sure. White Zombie with La Sexorcisto Devil Music Volume 1. Ministry with Psalm 69, The Way to Succeed and The Way to Suck Eggs, one of the early industrial metal albums, which I keep thinking I'm going to get it. Black Sabbath, Dehumanizer, Iron Maiden, Fear of the Dark. I seem to remember also even Iron Maiden, when they were recording this album, the producer said, we need a little bit more of a raw sound, closer to grunge. Yeah. And then we have, it was Blind Guardian also, the whole European power metal scene with Blind Guardian. There were other bands as well. No, I'm noticing here the beginning of the progressive rock revival showing up here with Echolens, Suffocating the Bloom. That is a pretty cool American prog rock band. Jadis, neo-prog band. And then Mike Oldfield with Tubular Bells 2, almost 20 years after the first one. Also interesting, we have My Dying Bride as the flower withers, the death doom scene. Rage Against the Machine, self-titled album. These are all kind of like really haphazardly thrown together. It looks like Bolt Thrower, The Fourth Crusade, another death metal album out of UK. Tourniquet, I mentioned, Pathogenic Ocular Dissonance, a Christian thrash metal band. And some other interesting things here. Debut albums by Vader, Demigod, and Incantation. Death metal bands there in the 1990s. And actually the Demigod album, is it in here? I don't remember. It is. Ah, it's in my list. Okay. So, how about that list, huh? Okay, so I'll tell you this. Some albums were no-brainers for me. They just had to be in here. And others, I had to check what bands were releasing albums that year, and was I interested in that album? Is that one really worth picking out, or do I actually think another one of their albums from another year is better? And then there were just some I was like, so what was happening? Check Metal Music Archives, check Prog Archives, and then, that album was from 92. And after I made my 7, I suddenly remembered, there's one very important band who had an album in 92 that I really love, and I can't kick anybody else off the list, so it's going to be 8. Kind of like a special mention. All right, so let's see. What's my list? So first of all, I did talk about the progressive rock revival that started around 1992, and we got Dream Theater with Images and Words. Probably their best known album, the album that has their only hit song ever. I think they had a compilation album called Greatest Hit and Other Songs, because they only ever had that one hit. But anyway, Images and Words, this was exactly it's the way I see it is that Dream Theater were doing kind of what Rush was doing in the 70s. Rush were essentially a hard rock band interested in hard rock and heavy metal, and they liked prog, and they said, hey, let's try to incorporate progressive rock into our hard rock. And I think that's what Dream Theater also did. They were into Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Metallica, but they were also into Rush and I think Yes and some of the other bands. And so they thought, well, yeah, let's do this. Let's incorporate progressive styled rock, like very complex and intelligent rock music into heavy metal. And then I actually haven't heard the debut, but this was the second album, the first one with James LaBrie on vocals, and this is it. This is where Dream Theater really began soaring. Not actually my favorite Dream Theater album, but certainly a very important one, so it gets mentioned. I talked about this next one before. This is Sloan with Smeared, one of my favorite Canadian bands of all time. Really love this band, and they have been through so many changes also in their music style. 4 members right from the beginning, same 4 guys together now. They actually do have a 5th, which they brought in about 15 years ago now. But anyway, same 4 guys, always doing the writing and the singing, and this very first album is heavily influenced by My Bloody Valentine and the British shoegaze scene at the time there. So they were actually a band that came out of the hardcore underground scene in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and that kind of got mixed with this My Bloody Valentine sound. So you've got lots of distortion, layered distortion and feedback, but also these strong vocal melodies and a bit of an edge at times as well. So that's Sloan, Smeared, their debut album in 1992. Okay, Megadeth. Now, honestly, after the 1980s, I think after Rust in Peace, I did not follow Megadeth anymore for a very long time. But I thought I should pick up what they did after Rust in Peace. So I got the next 3 albums. And this one here, Countdown to Extinction, I think is probably my favorite of the next 3 to come after Rust in Peace. I really like Sweating Bullets because I like Dave Mustaine's singing style, that kind of... He's got that sneer, and it sounds like he's spitting, and half speaking, half singing and spitting, and that is really exaggerated on this Sweating Bullets song here. I almost found it was too much at first, but I really quickly got to like it. And other things on here, Symphony of Destruction, that is a classic one there. Countdown to Extinction, High Speed Dirt, Foreclosure of a Dream. This is a really cool album, I think. Megadeth, Countdown to Extinction. Every time I think, I'm not so sure if I really want to listen to it, I look at the song titles in the back and go, yeah, I want to listen to it. Okay, cool. All right. So this next album is kind of interesting. This is A Blaze in the Northern Sky by Darkthrone, their second album. This is part of the whole Norwegian black metal scene, which had been kind of building up since the very tail end of the 80s, I think. It didn't really hit its peak. I think it was around 1994 where the black metal scene, especially the Norwegian black metal scene, really kind of had its big explosion, like with death metal in 1991. And this album is also interesting because it is the transitional phase where Darkthrone's previous album, their debut, was actually a death metal album. And this album here shows the transition going from death metal going towards black metal. And of course, at this time you had the other key bands already coming out, like Burzum and Mayhem, already releasing albums at this time. I don't remember, when was it that Euronymous died? Was it 91 or 92? I forget now. But anyway, yeah. And one album I just thought, when I saw, this is from 92, I just had to mention it, because out of the 2 or 3 Darkthrone albums I've heard, I like this one best, actually. Okay, talking about death metal, I named some of the bands that had debut albums out this year, and of course there were some that had before, but my pick, I was really thinking Malevolent Creation's second album, Retribution, but then I listened to it and I compared it with Demigods' Slumber of Sullen Eyes, and I just kind of favored this one a little bit more. So here we have Demigod, Slumber of Sullen Eyes. I guess... Like, again, not so many death metal albums in 92 that I'm aware of or that are in my collection. They're mostly from 91 or 90 or whatever. And Death also had an album this year, and I actually don't have that one. But, so anyway, yeah, Demigod, Slumber of Sullen Eyes, my pick out of my death metal album collection for 1992. Really cool. I love the vocal sound on here. It's that really deep, guttural vocal style. I think a lot of other death metal bands were still coming into the guttural style, but having a bit of the thrash influence still behind them. Not everybody, of course, some of them, but this is what I imagine death metal vocals sound like anyway. And this one here, I probably wouldn't have thought about it, but it came up on the list when I was checking Metal Music Archives. This is Paradise Lost. I believe it's their third album, Shades of God, another death doom band. This was my first Paradise Lost album, and actually I really liked it. And the previous album, their second album, Goth, is actually the one that's talked about more. But I heard this one first, and then I heard Goth, and I still kind of favor this one a little bit more here. But yeah, really cool, and I think a British band, right? And they just had an album out in 2021, Obsidian, so they're still active, still going along here. So there we go, Paradise Lost, Shades of God. Okay, and then let's take a turn into the progressive rock scene. This is Anglerguard with Hubris, I guess. I'm not exactly sure. It's spelled, I think, the Scandinavian way. But anyway, this one. Anglerguard only have about 3 or 4 albums out. But this one here from 92, this is so much like the kind of just best elements of 70s progressive rock. And just like, hey, let's make a 90s version with really good playing and good style. Let's just make really complex, exciting progressive rock. And this is a brilliant progressive rock album, I think. Now, of course, in the 90s, the progressive rock revival, a lot of the bands were looking back to the 70s. I think in more recent years, the last 10, 15 years, a lot of bands have actually been going back to the 80s as well. Some even dabbling in the 90s a little bit. But this one here is definitely a 70s inspired progressive rock album, and it's really brilliant if that's your thing. Okay, now that was the 7 albums, but then, as I said, there was one more band I really should have thought about, and I didn't want to kick anybody else off. So, 1992, the Japanese band Ningen Isu release Kogon no Yoake, The Golden Dawn, and this is their 3rd album and the final album with the original lineup. A very difficult album for them to make, apparently. I talked about this in my video about album by album, about Ningen Isu, but anyway, this, for me, is one of their most interesting albums. They, of course, are a kind of like a 70s-inspired, British hard rock, heavy rock-inspired, little bit of a progressive attitude as well, plus a little bit of like 80s speed metal or thrash thrown in. But this one here is where they really, I think, attempted a progressive rock, progressive metal album. Just because many of the tracks are longer and they experiment more with changing the tempos and putting in different parts to the songs. And you've also got Kenichi Suzuki's, what is it called? Subarashi Nichiobi, Wonderful Sunday, which is actually an acoustic guitar instrumental based on a Russian piece of music, because he studied Russian literature in university. Anyway, I love this album still. It is probably one of my top 5 Ningen Isu albums, so I really had to throw this one in. Okay, so anyway, and after this, their fortunes would start to become much more difficult. They would lose their drummer, and soon after that, they would lose their label, and they would become an indie band for a little while. But anyway, that's what I got for 1992, and that's what I got to say about 1992. And yeah, that's it. So that concludes part 3 of episode 49. That concludes episode 49, which means next is going to be episode 50, which means I'll probably have to do something special. But anyway, thank you all for watching, and I appreciate the people who have been commenting on the last 2 videos here in this episode 49. Thank you very much for your comments. Okay, everybody, take care and see you around probably next month by the time I come up with episode 50. All right, catch you then. Bye.